Okay, so we've hit 2 o'clock. So I think I'll kick off now. So thanks very much for joining us today. We're thrilled to be able to welcome you to our Responsible Disruption Innovation Zoomcast. My name is James Gamage, and I'm the Director of Innovation and the Social Impact Lab at the United Way of Calgary and Area.
And my name is Sydney Johnson, and I'm the design lead at J5, a Calgary-based innovation and design firm. And together we're the hosts of Responsible Disruption. We're excited to welcome our guests as we explore the important conversation of socially engaged artists and their importance to the betterment of society. But before we begin, in the spirit of our journey to promote reconciliation, I would like to honor the truth of the shared history and acknowledge Treaty 7 territory and the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Kainai, Siksika, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda nations, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. I would also like to recognize the Métis people and the Inuit people who have made their home here in Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. We stand against racism and intolerance in any form. We believe everyone deserves to live in equitable communities built on inclusion, diversity, understanding, and tolerance. At the Social Impact Lab, we strive to put people first to create a diverse and inclusive culture where everyone feels safe and valued.
Next, we have a few housekeeping items to cover and our agenda for today. So if you'd like to ask a question along the way, you can do that by clicking on the Q&A button on your Zoom panel, probably at the bottom of the screen. We'll be collecting them throughout our Innovation Table Zoomcast, and we will try and answer as many of those as we can during the end, by the end of the session. We are recording this session, so if you want to share it with your colleagues or friends, we will email you a link in the next couple of days. And the recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. If you want to know more about future episodes of Responsible Disruption in 2022, please follow the Social Impact Lab on Eventbrite. So now we'll review the topic and introduce our guests for today.
Right, so a little bit about what we've been doing over not just this episode today, but over the last month and continuing a little bit into June. But first, the Social Impact Lab is a collaboration between J5 Design and the United Way of Calgary and Area. And in the lab, we aim to accelerate innovation and drive change for those in our community who struggle within an inequitable system. Our approach to social innovation is collaborative, it's challenging, it's thought-provoking, and our goal is to see more people from across the social spectrum make connections, find common ground, build on their expertise, and see each other as real collaborators for change. Our Responsible Disruption Zoomcasts, of which you're a part of one right now, are a series of discussions with leading players in innovation and change and within their fields of expertise. As an extension of our usual Zoomcast that we've done for quite a few weeks now, and as a step for the Social Impact Lab into the arts world, this episode today is part of a larger event series that began early May, and as I said, will continue through mid-June with several events and experiences that you can take part in. And it's not too late, there are still some going on. This includes an art-based scavenger hunt in downtown Calgary, which you can, with the chance to win an Oculus Quest 2. If you're not into VR, I highly recommend getting yourself an Oculus Quest 2, probably through this scavenger hunt. And as well as an arts expo that we're hosting on Saturday at the Espresso Cafe in Kensington from 12 to 5. We'd love you to drop into that as well at any point in time. In building this event series, we've realized that socially engaged artists and those of us working in social innovation often speak the same language, share similar goals and values, but rarely have the opportunity to work together. So with this series of events, we had two goals. Firstly, to overlap the world of socially engaged artists and social innovators to create and strengthen different touch points, hopefully with the result of new collaborations, projects, funding sources, ideas, and all those intangible ripples that come from creating connections between amazing people. And secondly, to put some love and resources behind appreciating and shining a light on local artists and arts organizations who spend their lives working towards a better world. So if you're interested in any of the other events that we've got going on, you can visit thesocialimpactlab.com/creative constellations, which is the name of our event series this month.
Okay, so let's make this week's guests. So our first guest is Deeter Schurig. So Deeter is the president and CEO of cSPACE Projects, a social enterprise developing affordable and sustainable spaces for artists, nonprofits, and creative entrepreneurs. Deeter has been key to developing the award-winning cSPACE Creative Hub that showcases the adaptive reuse of a historic 100-year-old school site into a transformed LEED Gold civic asset. This is the first facility for cSPACE in a network of large-scale, multidisciplinary creative spaces planned for Calgary. Deeter's diverse experience extends throughout community engagement, design development, construction management, facility operations, and ongoing creative placemaking. Prior to cSPACE, Deeter practiced as a stage designer for over a decade, working on theatre projects across Canada. Deeter has a Master's in Architecture and a Strategic Leadership Certificate from Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. These diverse experiences inform inspired leadership towards designing, developing, and managing spaces for creatives to thrive while developing vibrant communities. With his family in Calgary, Deeter has an interest in livable cities, innovative design, transformative architecture, and a growing interest in sailing folding kayaks. Welcome, Deeter. Next, we have Vicki Stroich. So Vicki is a dramaturge, non-profit leader, and community builder with over 20 years experience. Designing and hosting creative spaces and fostering collaboration are Vicki's greatest passions. She is currently Artistic and Environmental Programs Manager at Caravan Farm Theatre in Armstrong, BC. Prior to joining Caravan Farm Theatre, Vicki was based in Calgary and worked as Engagement Director for Alberta Eco Trust and worked at Alberta Theatre Projects, serving as the company's Executive Director. Vicki has recently been exploring the intersection of the art and environmental sectors by participating in local and national programs and committees that bring the work of artists and environmental communities together. She has a BFA in drama from University of Calgary and an extension certificate in social innovation and change making from Mount Royal University. Vicki has received a Betty Mitchell Award for Outstanding Achievement for her work on new Canadian plays and is an Avenue Magazine Top 40 Under 40 alumni. Welcome, Vicki. And finally, we have Melanee Murray-Hunt. Melanee Murray-Hunt is an actor, writer, filmmaker, and producer. She has won awards for her films Race Anonymous and The Trial of Miss Mudimbe. She is the recipient of 3 awards for her solo theatre show, The Hoodwink, and has garnered critical acclaim for her play, The Venus of Basin Street. In front of the camera, she can be seen in various independent and feature films, as well as television and stage. On-screen credits include cSPACE, Judging Amy, 24, Hallmark's Meet Me at Christmas, APTN's Tribal, Nickelodeon's 100 Deeds for Eddie McDowd, and award-winning indie film Black and Blue, among others. Her most recent short, The Invincible Jason Garvey, is being rebirthed as a digital series. Melanee is currently a member of the artist cohort at the Trico Changemaker studio at Mount Royal University. She has done socially innovative work utilizing the arts for the non-profit organization Suggest on domestic violence. She has also worked in a similar capacity for Action Dignity, another non-profit on the Our Canada, Our Story series. And she has initiated and innovated diversity in the arts by starting Calgary's first Black theatre company, as well as its first Black film festival for Black History Month. Other innovative work includes starting a reading series for children at Pages Books. So welcome to you all. So we're going to go into the questions now after those introductions. But before I go into that, I'm really conscious, and when Sydney and myself set these Zoom casts up, we're really conscious that we don't want it all to be about the questions that we have. So we have a long list of questions, but of more importance is answering the questions of our audience. So this is an encouragement to you as the audience to ask questions of the panel. If you can do so in the Q&A box that you'll see the icon at the bottom of the screen, and myself and Sydney will be able to field those questions to the panelists. If you want to direct one at a specific panelist, please do so. Otherwise, we'll ask a general question. So please ask those questions, and it will make it for a much more interesting Zoomcast. But nevertheless, before we are able to answer those questions, let's go through some of the questions that myself and Sydney have lined up for this panel. So I'm going to ask Deeter first. And this is a question about, the cSPACE Creative Hub and your role as president and CEO. So considering the organizations, businesses, and artists who patronize the space, can you tell us what the importance of placemaking is in creating social change through the arts, Deeter?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yeah, as you mentioned, the cSPACE Creative Hub in Calgary and South Calgary, it's home to about 30 tenants of artists and nonprofit organizations, and there's community assets such as exhibition spaces and meeting spaces and so forth. And I think the role of placemaking is critical, because I think it's about engaging the community in the places that are make up their neighborhoods. So I think for me, I've had the good fortune of working in the theater, and you create wonderful moments in the theater. But I think that the community can be viewed as the same kind of thing, that you create performances within spaces, and then they become endearing, and they're cared for, and they're looked after, and they become safe places and activated spaces. So I think for me, placemaking is a critical way of activating ways that contribute to vibrant communities and vibrant cities ultimately.
Cool. Okay, thank you. And thinking about the vision for cSPACE, I think in your bio it mentioned that the location in Mardeloop is the first of a few, but what's the vision around the growth of cSPACE in Calgary and beyond?
Yeah, the vision, and I think it's largely spawned from the need, is that we see that artists, nonprofits, creative entrepreneurs, they need space. They need affordable space. They need community gathering places, and they need places to share and have knowledge sharing opportunities. And so we see that part of that is creating these hubs that have bring together the small players into a collective promising and inspiring vision that gathers all of those different things. So our hope is that that there's other creative hubs in Calgary of the scale that meet the current needs of what the creative community requires. So in my hope and dreams, we would have one in every quadrant and one downtown, so that there's these networked assets across the city.
And has the business community got involved in cSPACE to date? And you talked about nonprofits and artists, but is the business community a member of your location currently?
Yeah, our business is both development from a construction and land use point of view, but also operations of the facilities. So our primary social mission is about supporting artists and nonprofits. So that's what kind of guides the business. But we also open up our facilities to other businesses to use. So we're widely distributed across sort of social impact, independent artist use, creative industries, and other corporate clients. And then also partnerships, partnerships with through sponsorships of our community building work, but also through development, working with developers as well. So we kind of touch the business world in multiple ways.
Okay, thank you.
Very cool. Vicki, we'll go to you next. Looking at the professional journey you've been on, it looks like you've managed to go through a transition from the arts into the environment, and now you're holding hands with both of those worlds. What did it take for you to make that leap from theater to the environment, and how did you go about that?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's a journey that I'm still discovering, and every time I get a chance to articulate it, I learn something new. So, and I just want to start by saying too, I just want to recognize that I'm zooming in from a different location. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the unceded territory of the Secwepemc and Syilx Okanagan nations in just outside what is called Armstrong, BC. How did I find myself here? Great question. Most of my career was in nonprofit arts and culture as a dramaturg, so working with playwrights and theater creators, dance makers, as they created their work. And then I became increasingly interested in leadership positions and wanted to know more about how the structures and systems that impacted how that work was made and supported worked, so that I could perhaps help them make work better, perhaps. And so with those questions and that curiosity, I found myself in the opportunities to take up leadership positions. So I ended up finding myself in an executive director position at Alberta Theatre Projects and learned quite a bit about how nonprofits work, and in particular, how nonprofit arts work. But my other passion was the environment. And when you're running a nonprofit of any kind, you don't have a lot of space and time to actually contribute to some of the things that you care about beyond sometimes what you're focused on through your work. And as I was thinking about what do I want to do next, I wanted to have a relationship to the environment. And at first I thought, well, maybe I'll volunteer, maybe I'll, join a board or something like that. But as I was leaving my executive director position, there was a position available at Alberta Eco Trust. And I also had the opportunity to, with Melanee and quite a few other artists, start with the Artist as Changemaker program through Calgary Arts Development and Trico Changemakers. So I started the kind of vocabulary of social impact and social innovation, and started to see and translate what the inherent skills or experiences that myself as an artist, as a dramaturg, what that could mean to helping to further the mission of other organizations that want to make an impact. I didn't quite understand how it translated, but I started to learn a bit more about how it did. And my experience in nonprofit management also was a real help. And so when I looked at this posting from Alberta Eco Trust, whose mission I really admired, I went, oh, I've done that. It's just called something different in my world. So engagement work, hosting conversations around things that are of great importance, helping to define narrative and story and meaning, that's all part of what I did. I just didn't know quite how to say that until I saw how it translated. So the work at Alberta Eco Trust was really wonderful in that I was able to bring myself as an artist, but also bring what I'd learned as a nonprofit manager to that work, and that what I brought was valued. And I learned very quickly that a lot of the folks in the environmental community that I was talking to were deeply interested in working with artists, but didn't know how to reach out. And the artists I worked with were really interested in the environment, but didn't know anyone who worked in it. And so I was suddenly in a surprising position to become a bit of a sector connector, which was a great thing. So that's sort of how the journey happened. And then with this role that I'm in now, this is an organization that manages 80 acres of land in the North Okanagan, produces shows, hosts artists throughout the year. And so they sort of realized, we haven't had an explicit relationship to environmentalism or to land stewardship or to climate change, and we need to. And so given my unique background, they reached out to me, and I certainly know the organization from working here before. So that's how I found myself here. And that interest in weaving and connecting the two sectors started to emerge in the Alberta Eco Trust work, and then found a sort of interesting new expression here at this role. So it's a new role, so we'll see what happens. And there's lots of possibilities, but it's exciting to be starting something like this.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for that summary. I'm curious, it sounds like your background was well accepted. I'm curious if you had any roadblocks though, or any hurdles making your way from arts into environment, or anything unexpected on that journey?
Excellent question. I think the understanding that I got from doing the social innovation extension certificate at Mount Royal really did help me understand the particular vocabulary, because there's sometimes some very specific terms in theater, just like there's specific terms in every sector. Every sector has its codes it's vocabulary, it's sort of, it's secret language. And so that was one of the key barriers. And I was fortunate that I got a look at some of the vocabulary that was shared across sectors. And I think initiatives like the Social Impact Lab and, Changemaker Studio, things like that are bringing different sectors together around a shared vocabulary of change making, I think will increasingly help that translation happen. And so I really appreciate that these conversations are happening, and that organizations and people with different skills and ways of looking and perspectives are able to talk a little bit more, because I think that means that the barriers may be further removed as we move forward. Mm-hmm. And I would say too that sometimes, the word art and the way that society writ large perceives art and artists, I think sometimes can be a barrier, in that I think that sometimes people have to sort of understand what it is you do. I don't know if Melanee might be able to relate to this, and maybe Deeter as well. That question, so what did you do? Like, how did you make a living at that? Or like, I even experienced barriers and interesting questions as I took up the executive directorship at Alberta Theatre Projects about whether or not I was comfortable with numbers and things like that, where I was like, just because I've spent a lot of time with words doesn't mean I don't understand numbers. And numbers are a vocabulary. Numbers are a language. And financial statements tell the story of an organization. It's a narrative. It's a form of narrative. So all of these things translate. It's just us understanding how they translate and expressing how we see them translating and how our skills apply. So I think there are barriers when people think about art. I think there's barriers when we think about there being barriers and sort of impassable sort of boundaries between sectors. The reality of it is we all have to collaborate. And so we have to start to get over those barriers. And some of them are self-imposed. Sometimes I think we think we don't have anything to offer. And I think even some of the folks that I know who worked in the environmental sector didn't think they were creative. Just like, there may be internal barriers from artists not thinking they know enough about a certain subject to participate in change making. I think we self-impose the barriers, and I think there's some barriers that are external to us. And I think they can be overcome, but it requires a lot of meeting in the middle and shared vocabulary.
That's opportune. You mentioned barriers, because the next question we had was actually for Melanee around that. So I know, Melanee, when you were talking to Dan in preparation for this episode, you talked about people who have their creativity dampened in their youth and rediscovering artistic pursuits later in life. And I probably would include myself in that bracket. So what advice would you give to those who want to play but don't think they have the ability or talent to play in the creative space?
I think one of the things I would advise folks to do is to consider history and maybe look a little bit into anthropology in terms of the fact that human beings have always collectively created. It's only sort of in recent human history that people have compartmentalized their talents and their skills for our increasingly agrarian capitalist society. But initially, all of us, if you look at quote unquote primitive or early societies or hunter-gatherer, everybody sat around and wove baskets and created art and embellished what they did. This compartmentalization is actually just about the time we're in, but we are all innately creative. And it took a village to create an art piece, prior to where we are right now. So I think looking at that, we have to get it out of our heads that it's for that lofty person over there to create art. We are innately creative beings. We are innately, everything we do is about creative problem solving. So I think we have to remember that before we go, I can't do that. That's for somebody over there who went to the Louvre or something, to train. think that's the first thing we have to do.
And what about the role of, you know, how do you create the safe space for people to do that? And, you know, and is it physical space or is it mental space?
I think that's a great question. I think when I came here, I started writing plays, and I wanted to find someone who understood what I was trying to express as a Black woman, not just the experience of being Black, but the history and the way narratives represented Black women, you know, in our collective history up till now, wanting to change that and not being able to find anyone who had a passionate investment in that beyond a sort of an intellectual curiosity or acceptance of me. So, and I knew that if I needed that, someone else needed that. I always grew up, I was integrated into a lot of places, and my mother would say, if you're having problems, somebody else is probably having problems. And so you have to open the door for all those little Black girls that are going to come after you. And that was drummed into my head at an early age. So I remember I wrote this play, and the second iteration of it, I felt like as I got deeper into the historical elements of human trafficking and Black women transcendence over that, all of those things, I felt like I couldn't find anybody who had an emotional attachment to that. And I had tried to get all the Black actors on stage. There were like 4 in Calgary. So I tried to get them all on stage in one play. And I thought, we need a theater company. We need a place where we nurture each other, and we take care of each other. I even saw that as a parent. It's very isolating to be a parent of a small child at times if you're not with your family. And so as a parent, I thought, where can moms get together, promote literacy for their children, educate their children, and then sit on the circle and just talk to each other and get out of the house. So I started the reading group at Pages, and I started a theater company called Ellipses Tree. And I started, as I mentioned, the Black Film Festival, constantly trying to get people to understand that even though our stories are different, they're valid and they're interesting and dynamic. And so I think creating those projects does create a mental space. I think the mental space is key. I love that. I love that it actually created that mental space and the idea that what you have to say in your experiences are valid. Finding a space is always, an actual physical space for that is always a challenge, despite the best efforts of Deeter. But the first thing that has to happen is the idea. The concept has to live, and from that, everything will follow.
Cool. And Deeter, do you have anything to say about the sort of the importance of physical space and what you've seen in your experience at cSPACE?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, it's when we started developing the space, cSPACE, and going through design and so forth, you know, we put our best efforts towards adaptability and flexibility and trying to future-proof the physical space. But I think what's become increasingly more interesting is about the safety of space and the inclusion of space. And so, you know, you asked, how do you approach that? And I think it brings up a really interesting challenge about, you know, sort of not diminishing these conversations, but actually expanding and having really rich conversations about different people's biases and perceptions and so forth, about how do you create safe space. So, you know, maybe making spaces accessible, for example, physically, seems like it's the lowest common denominator. If we can do that, that's a wonderful thing. But then you look at the different barriers that people experience, and whether it's sight or sound or whatever you contend with, those bring up whole different variables about navigating physical space. I think one of the most exciting things of the last year that cSPACE has done is we undertook a process to create a idea commitment, an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility commitment. And that work was done on the premise that to date, you know, we're a young organization, and we created a physical space, and we sort of did it on a napkin sketch with good intent, but it wasn't backed by, you know, strong policy and so forth. We're figuring that out as we go. But we committed to this idea of creating an idea commitment. But what was, I think, the most satisfying part and maybe the success of it was that we opened it up beyond us. So we had board representation and we had some staff there, but I brought in tenants who have an investment in being in our space. I brought in a coworker and then brought in external stakeholders to be part of forming that vision statement around idea, diversity, equity, inclusion together. And I think that makes it so much more committed in a way, because you've kind of taken it out of your own echo chamber and brought it out into the community to form it. And I think what I'm really looking forward to is, you know, I don't think there's a singular approach to these kind of challenges. You know, we talk about how do you make safe spaces? Well, that's an ongoing conversation that's going to need policy. It's going to be setting a culture within the building and within the staff and people who occupy it. So it's a rich conversation to have.
Thank you. And Vicki, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just was thinking about the concept of space, you know, as Deeter was speaking, and the concept of safe space as well. And I think one of the things that, you know, in addition to physical space, the way we respect space and time to experiment is something that I think is can sometimes be unfortunately scarce. And in order to solve some of the complex challenges that we're facing, we need the space to examine the challenge, prototype and test things, think about things, and that takes time. And the urgency, the sort of tension between the time it takes to come up with the best questions and try some possible answers, while there's also the urgency of the issue, can be very hard. And so how to, you know, have the physical space that is, you know, safe and welcoming, and how also to create space and time, the sort of mental, creative, spiritual space to actually open up and you know, create something. That's something that I think artists, we have rehearsal halls, we have residencies, we have retreats and things like that that are meant to foster that kind of openness and space for people. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily found its way into some of the social impact work in the way that it could possibly. And perhaps it is, and I have not yet quite experienced it. But I do think that that's an element of space that we don't often talk about that I think is important. And also the space for error and for, I mean, I guess the word failure, but, you know, all of that learning space that comes as well. I think something I experienced in the environmental sector was, because the stakes are so high and because so much of the conversation is policy and science-based, this sort of the risk of imagining, the risk that comes with imagination and creativity, and sometimes, dare I say, playfulness, is not something that's often a part of those worlds, although certainly not in policy, perhaps in science. But I think there's something about the quality of space and the way that we define space that is really important as well. And I think, you know, having a safe, beautiful support platform like cSPACE is part of that first step. And there's so many other ways too to think about space. And so that was just something I was reflecting on as I listened to Deeter.
Well,
Yeah. Go, sorry.
Melanee. I think Melanee was going to speak.
I directed a play that last year or the year before, and I remember thinking, once again, I was at an obstacle, a roadblock in trying to find actors, Black actors. A lot of people come here to work in the oil industry, and or they're more, what side of the brain is, you know, engineering and economics and tech and all of that. A lot of people don't flock here like they do Toronto and Vancouver to do art. And that includes BIPOC people. And I remember trying to cast this play and just feeling really frustrated because I had to train people who had a lot of innate talent, but were never told and encouraged to pursue the arts. And that was it. And it was a part of being first generation Canadians. It was a part of coming from cultures where things are sometimes more traditional. And so they had never taken themselves seriously in that, or they weren't allowed to take that seriously. And if they did, they weren't going to come to Calgary to really, really pursue that. And so I remember after that show talking to Josh Dalladoni at Arts Commons and saying, I want a room just to have people to work things out. I found also in the past when I was trying to write things and experiment with things and find this voice that was probably anti-colonial, probably challenging in some way, that as soon as I hit a snag, it was like, oh, done, we're done. And we can't develop you. And it was as soon as I went up against that, I had some success, I had some failure, I had all of those things. And I felt like as a marginalized person, that unless I was perfect, and this is a thing that hangs over BIPOC people all the time. And a lot of us have passed those hurdles. I was the goody two shoes in class that knew all the answers, blah, blah, blah. But unless we are perfect, that second time, that first time out, it's done. It's done. You're gone. And it's as if the innate talent that got us into that space in the first place doesn't exist at all. And so that's also why I wanted to start a theater company in a film festival and create films that would employ all kinds of artists and do all kinds of things, because I wanted to give people that opportunity to grow. I wanted to do that. And so, fortunately, Josh is a great guy. I ended up not actually doing that. I developed a program for another theater company, and then didn't, and that's kind of what I've been doing, is kind of developing things, handbooks, et cetera, for people, but still just pushing that idea. And I think that once again, that goes to the headspace. It allows people who have not felt entitled to create and express themselves, even the concept that they can. And that's the first thing that some underserved, marginalized, underrepresented people need, is even to be able to conceive that they have a voice and a story and a narrative to share.
Yeah, it's bringing me back to, what Vicki talked about before as well, about language and that barrier of knowing the right words to say. And that's not just sector to sector, but also community to community. And so we actually have an audience question that came when you were speaking before, Vicki, but I think it's relevant to where we are in the conversation now, which is, how does someone get comfortable speaking the language of change making and social innovation, or any area they're interested in, and what can make the language of change making more accessible? So leave that to anyone who wants to answer.
This might seem a little like maybe it's too simple an answer, but I'll attempt it. I mean, I think authentic curiosity, like expressing an authentic curiosity and not worrying, like trying not to worry. I know, like saying to someone, don't worry. It's like, but trying not to worry that people will judge you for not knowing something. And, people used to say to me when I would go for sort of mentor calls or something like that, I don't know, I didn't know if you'd respond to my email. And I was like, of course I did. I'd love to go for coffee and talk to people. If you never would have asked, then probably we wouldn't have gone for coffee. But I think looking around, and is there an organization, is there an initiative that you are curious about or that you want to participate in? This is kind of, I guess, what I'm fortunate, again, from the privileged position that I came from. But I'm fortunate in that, I asked, and if I hadn't have asked or hadn't ever tried to pursue learning more about it, I probably wouldn't have gotten an opportunity to. But I think if there's an organization, an initiative that you're curious about and you want to participate in, reaching out and saying, hi, I'd like to learn more. I'm really curious. Is there a way to volunteer, or what would you suggest I go? Where would you suggest I go to find out more? I think that that's a good start, because some of us just are presented with the barrier of, I don't know it. I don't want people to think I'm like dumb for not knowing it. So I think I'll just maybe not ask. That's probably one of the key barriers to reaching out, and always reaching out and asking with that authentic curiosity and real care, and to participate. I often find that it's hard to deny folks who have that authentic curiosity and really seem to care. So that's something I would say, if there's something you're curious about, ask. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vicki. That's great. We have also some more audience questions. So I think this is a good one for everyone. It's not targeted at anyone. So I'll read it and then maybe we'll go around the room, the Zoom room. Is there a distinction for you between art as a profession and work and art as a passion or personal endeavor? Do you find yourself telling similar stories or working towards social change in your passion projects just as much as in your professional spaces? Which great question. So thanks to our audience member who shared that. Deeter, let's hear from you first, and then we'll go around to everyone.
Oh, I thought Melanee was leaning into that one. I saw
Melanee,
Go ahead.
No. Oh, you look like you were ready to go.
Well, I thought it was a great question, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say, Deeter. So.
It's a great question. I don't know if I've deliberated between the two. I think for me, art and social change are sort of inextricably woven up in just my existence and my practice that I'm still figuring out. But I think maybe if I was to go back to the previous question a little bit and building on the sage advice of Vicki, I would say that artists are so uniquely poised with the tools. And I think that earlier question was about finding the voice. And I've been searching for my voice for my entire career. And I would say that Vicki is absolutely right in terms of being curious. Like if you're curious about something, don't let anything get in your way. Just start asking the questions. Living into the questions, I think, is incredibly important. I also took note of making for the time and the space to do it. I had the good fortune of working in the theater for a decade as a stage designer, going project to project to project to project, and you line up well in advance because your meal ticket depends on it and your rent depends on it. But I needed to break the cycle. I needed to create the space to ask the difficult questions. And that's when I decided to go to university and do my master's degree in architecture. And I needed to change the lens, and I needed to change the view, and I needed to break the circuit in a way. So I think that could be an incredible part of framing the question, and maybe sort of taking away some of the fear of engaging these complex problems. I imagine that the rest of the panel, sort of looking at recent years, are confounded at times with the challenges that are presented in front of us, but without sort of leaning into them and being curious and exploring. I think those other skills I would think about with theater practitioners, for example, it's iterative, it's improvisation, it's asking those questions, falling flat, picking yourself up and asking them again, and not being so precious about the answer, but really helping define the question. And I think that's where innovation comes from, ultimately. So I'll pass it over to you, Melanee, because I'm sure you have much more insight.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm answering this very precisely. So if you could just read basically the gist of it again, just so I can make sure that I'm not going to go off on my own interpretation of it. So
is there a distinction for you between art as profession / work and art as passion / personal? Do you find yourself?
Yeah, I think that's so brilliant, and I'm glad I just reheard that. Yes, I have been in acting school. I started acting school or high school for the arts when I was 14. And before that, I went to classes. And I started working when I was about 14 as well. And going through adolescence and puberty with an acting career is very, very interesting. And you go through many permutations of loathing for the art, yourself, your handlers, everyone around you who starts to kind of rely on you to produce and perform. And it has always been a regenerative process for me to go back and find love for what I do. I also grew up, as I said, with an intense social consciousness, enforced upon me in a way by my community. I grew up in Baltimore, which is a very challenged community. And so that idea that every part of your life is about lifting up others, sometimes felt at opposition with the desire to play. And trying to find both of those things is a challenge and a balancing act. Somehow I managed to do it because I let myself be bedazzled by things, and I let myself have that, wonder. I let myself like things that, in art school would be considered sort of stupid, but then I find something that actually is resonant in a sort of universal way, and allowing myself that time, allowing myself my inner child, which I fully indulge and engage as much as possible, is the way to kind of renew that. And then the child in me is also like, this could be better. I wanted to answer the other question before, in terms of allowing yourself to see the ideal, not being, adamant and forceful about it, but allowing yourself to see the utopia as well as the dystopia, letting your imagination run with what could this be. I love dystopian novels and all of those things because as despairing as they can be, it is seeing the implications of the present moment and allowing your imagination to understand. That imagination is what keeps us instinctually alive. If we walk, into the water, we'll drown. We use an imagination for that. And that's a part of the impulse for social change as well. If we keep going down this path of this environment, we're going to fall apart. So allowing your imagination to play, even if it's in a somewhat negative way, is how we survive. And it's also how we have fun. And so all of it, when you're playing a difficult character and you're blubbering, why would you put yourself through that? I don't know. It's fun. It's fun. And I think that allowing yourself that all the time in looking at the world and saying, what could this be? What don't I want it to happen? And just letting that go organically is how I keep engaged with the passionate part as well as the professional social change part.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Melanee. Vicki, did you want to also chime in on this question?
Sure. And it was awesome to listen to Deeter and Melanee to talk about it. For me, I think I don't necessarily anymore make a firm distinction. And part of that is because I kept zooming out. And Melanee spoke a little earlier about our sort of compartmentalization of everything. So the idea that you can't be passionate about your work, or the idea that work is work and passion is passion. And indeed, everyone has a different experience. And in some cases, for some people that there is a distinction there. For me, and for a while, I might have thought that as well myself. I think what I was challenged to do as I started to think about not going along the track that I was headed along, because I was headed towards a specific track in nonprofit arts and culture that I could have probably just continued going on. But at a certain point, I had to ask myself, why and to what end? And what are you contributing? Like, what do you want? What are you trying to build? And I had to ask myself, is it something I want to build within an existing structure or something I want to build outside of it? And I was asked to, I think, in some cases, challenged to define what I wanted to do. Like, what do I want to leave as a legacy? What do I want to, how do I want to define what I do and what I contribute to art to the people around me. And I started to just zoom out and define it less as I am a dramaturg, I work with this kind of playwright on this kind of play. I host this kind of program. It's and it became a sort of sense that I want to create space for people to discover, to create together, and make that as rich an experience as possible. And so my mission statement, I guess, is actually in my bio. James read it. So the idea of the creating space. And so I can do that in all sorts of ways. That's my passion. It's also what has become my position. And so it was by zooming out and asking the larger question that I started to sort of see how the two are related, as opposed to trying to put title with title or output with output.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask another question now. CJ has asked, what do you think is the current relationship between the arts, nonprofit, social enterprise, and commercial business? What role do you think that social innovation should play in changing how we understand and engage with the arts in Calgary? Anyone want to take that one?
Vicki, I'll also allow you to expand that outside of Calgary if you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thinking about the relationship between the arts, nonprofit, social enterprise, and commercial business.
I'll start since I'm not a business person at all, but I think at the Artists Changemaker Studio, we've been asking that question. We've been asking, how do we embed or align ourselves with the central industries of our community? We want to have working artists, and we want art to be an everyday part of our lives. And so what we've done with the residencies there is to approach nonprofits and create a residency for artists to work with them to address what we call their wicked questions or their wicked problems. So if a nonprofit is dealing with homelessness and a very difficult question around that, the artist will come in and help them address that question, frame that question, answer that question through their work. And it's usually groups of artists who are already engaged in that process for themselves. So that's one way that we're doing it with non-for-profits and or nonprofits. And in terms of the corporate world, we are thinking about that with our new project, and it's still under construction right now. But I'm really excited about this next iteration of the residency, because we are going to, or we have the opportunity to start asking questions about, say, climate change. And I'm really excited about that, because that moves a little bit away from the nonprofits to corporations that are trying to balance their own wicked questions around this. How do we maintain people who are employed, and profits, and sustainability of our corporations, as well as addressing issues in the environment? And I'm really excited about that, even though I've been completely intimidated for various reasons about questions around climate change. Intimidated isn't the right word, but that hasn't been my focus in my social change endeavors. And so I think that my speculative fiction mind, my imagination that keeps going without me, it is part of what could help a corporation figure out how to balance whatever it is they're doing with a responsibility and a commitment to people in the future and to our environment, as well as the fact that people need jobs right now. So I'm kind of excited about that, because my imagination goes wild, and I am not thinking about barriers and all of those things. And even with those barriers, I feel like our imaginations can grow around them, and like a vine growing around a rock, we can encompass those problems and shift them with that imagination, with that unfettered freedom to think and speculate. So I think that that's one very specific way that corporations, artists, social change can intersect.
To build on what Melanee just said, I think for me, one of the things that there's the great potential for is for artists, social impact and social change, nonprofits, business, to come together to create abundance, like combat scarcity, because scarcity, and I don't just mean like, yes, scarcity of actual resources as well, but also scarcity of imagination. We will not create a world that, like, it's harder for people to get on board with something they can't imagine. And so we need to engage the imagination about what could come next. And I don't just mean utopian visions rendered in watercolor. I mean like ideas that are generated, even small ideas along in certain neighborhoods. Like, how do we create a sense of abundance of imagination? Because when confronted with the challenges that we face, it's hard not to be overwhelmed. We need to sort of find a crack in that wall. And that crack might be the imagination of what might come, even what the first few steps are like. So that's, yeah, creating abundance is something that I think that particular group of people, I say people, that's not, of actors can do. Yeah. And I appreciate the opportunity to expand it beyond Calgary, but I just left Calgary a month ago, so I've got tons of opinions about Calgary still. Don't worry about that.
Thank you. Deeter, anything to add there?
Yeah, thank you to Vicki and Melanee. This a really rich conversation. I would say that we are in such an interesting time, and Melanee mentioned a wicked problem, and that's what the impetus for me was. I need to do something, and this is intriguing that we've got a wicked problem, and there's no magic bullet. There's nothing that's gonna reverse it. So we need to tap into creativity. We need to tap into adaptability. We need to kind of live into something. And I'm a firm believer in, I don't have this all figured out. I just feel like I've got a good sense of the direction we need to go. And people more brilliant, more innovative, more imaginative will come up with incredible solutions to the challenges. But if we can just lean all in the right direction, then good things will happen. And, I consider myself very fortunate to have put that question out into the universe, given itself some time, and now to be running a social enterprise that can kind of sit at the nexus of all of these things and lean into the right direction. And I think it happens on so many levels. It happens on the level of artworks and projects, and it also happens on the level of policies and procedures and systems. But I'm really excited by those that are playing in those spaces. And I think the question about artists and nonprofits and corporate, like every day there's a conversation that's at the intersection of all of these things. That corporations are looking to nonprofits, but they're also leaders in their own right. We see the rise of B Corps and social enterprise, and that's an exciting place to be when we see, successful businesses that are contributing to our communities in meaningful ways.
Thank you. That's been a great way to finish up the questions. We've got to almost 3 o'clock now, so we're going to need to wind it up. But I love that that call to action and that positive view on how the community can come together and combat that scarcity. So thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to all 3 of you for an incredible conversation in the last hour or so. It's been incredibly enlightening to me, and I'm sure it will be to our audience as well. So thank you very much. But I need to wind it up, as I said. So, but before we say goodbye, we want to just invite you to our next event as part of Creative Constellations, and that's the Arts Expo. So everyone is welcome to join us for a drop-in exhibition celebrating art, creativity and social disruption, hosted by the Social Impact Lab and United Way of Calgary and Area this Saturday, June 4th, between 12 p.m. and 5 p.m. at the Espresso Cafe in Kensington, Calgary. So it'll be a fun and interactive way for local Calgarians to explore the intersection of art and social innovation in our city. Come to connect with different parts of the local arts and innovation worlds, engage your creative side by signing up for art workshops and see live performances. So if you want to find out more about that, visit thesocialimpactlab.com/creative constellations. And you can do that anytime for more information. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you again to our guests. Thanks to everyone who wrote in questions. We didn't get to all of them, so apologies for those that we didn't get to, but thank you so much for participating so well. We've recorded today's session and we'll share a link to the recording with you. And as always, it's available on our YouTube channel. And if you want to continue engaging with us at the lab or on this or any other topics, you can do so through Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We're at the Social Impact Lab. Thanks for joining us today.